Rise Fantasia is a Nintendo Wii game from 2010, and unfortunately, I think it gets sidelined a lot, probably likely due to its localization, and also just, I think, when you compare it to something like a Xenoblade or a Last Story, on the surface, it maybe doesn't look as impressive. And I think, like, presentation-wise, it looks very much like a PS2 or PSP game, despite, I think using the Wii's hardware in very effective ways. But this is also an era when games that were, considered traditional JRPGs were considered bad. The people were not open-minded to games with fixed cameras, zoomed out overworlds, turn-based combat systems, things like that. And, in some ways it is very Tales-like, especially in terms of its visual quality in a lot of ways. But it's on the Wii, probably because of the market penetration in some ways. But I also think that's helps make it stand out. And while I think in a lot of ways, a lot of people might kind of dock it for a lot of different reasons, I really think it is a game that stacks up against games like The Last Story and like Xenoblade. It's just how it stacks up is a little less obvious. And the two things that I think make this game especially special is the combat system, and also just really distinct character interactions that have some story gimmicks that affect the gameplay itself at times. Starting with the combat system, it's very dense. It is a turn-based game with a round structure to its turns, basically. So you basically plan out the entire set of skills for your whole party, and then you can confirm. Each skill has a speed, and so depending on which skill it is or the number of actions you've taken that turn already, that skill will be pushed back into a turn-based order that appears at the bottom of the screen that you can also see enemy actions and skills as well. I think I've heard Grandia has a similar system. However, I do recall when I played Final Fantasy X there being some similar mechanics there as well. But what was really stand out about this game, or maybe what makes this game a little bit more distinct, is that there's something that I don't know what it's called in game, but I would call it skill stacking is kind of a big part of this game, which basically means that if characters use the same skill, or one character use the same skill back to back, it enhances that skill in some way. So if one character uses the attack action 4 times in a row, 4 single attacks that happen at different points in the turn order will instead combine down to the first attack, and then it'll be a 4-hit combo. That also means that if you have 2 characters who cast Fire 1, then it makes that spell Fire 2. They all have to be turned, when it's multi-characters, though, it all has to be cast kind of within the same time frame of that turn. You can't have Fire 1 cast at the beginning and the end of the turn and have those combined. But they're also, enhanceable in other ways, though, like these elemental crystals that appear on the field and stuff like that. So where the bottleneck is in this game, for its skills and what players can use, is the action point system. And these action points are a party-wide set of action points. So every action you do costs a certain number of points, and you can fully mix and match, how you want to do this. So if you want characters that don't do anything on a turn, you can let them do nothing. Or you can have an individual character play out an entire turn on their own. It's a really fun system, but I think what's really cool about this in the case of Rise Fantasia is that this is not a player-exclusive system. This is a system that is heavily used by enemies and heavily abused, and especially on bosses. You will find there are times where bosses are really geared up in ways to utilize this system to its fullest. So it's really easy to quickly die because the enemy team is going to throw something at you that you haven't seen before, a combination of skills you haven't thought of before. And it's great for learning new ideas and mechanics that you can apply to future fights and things like that. The game really goes out of its way to challenge you with these ideas and put them in your face and show you how devastating they are directly to you as the player by killing you with them. Which is only bad in the way that save points are kind of haphazardly placed throughout this game, and unfortunately there's no retry system to battles, so there are frequently times you'll lose 30 minutes to an hour of progress, or entire dungeons occasionally as well, because you walked into a fight, you had no idea what they're going to do, and the first turn is just them destroying you immediately, which is extra frustrating since if you don't know how to deal with that tactic, you can't just quickly try something new. You have to do that entire section again before you try to fight the boss again, and then hopefully not get destroyed this time. So you have to really sit down and think about it at the start of a dungeon after you've died and been okay, what am I doing when I get there, and what am I prepared to do so when I get into that fight I can react immediately and survive, because a lot of fights really are focused on initially surviving a wave of onslaughts at the start, and then once you've learned to deal with that, managing damage from there as you slowly kind of pick away at the boss and things like that. Every fight really asks you to be as best prepared as possible, and the game is also very stringent about you using every resource available to you. You are going to need to use your items. There's not a lot of item hoarding you can do in this game. Debuffs and buffs are incredibly helpful. You really want to go out of your way to make sure those are applied. It's not like most other JRPGs where those things are going to be resisted by default by the bosses. Every element of the combat system matters, and the game is really not afraid to push you to use those things. I did find I had to grind a lot at times, but ultimately I think that grinding still wasn't like me overpowering the game. It was about giving myself more resources so I could better prepare myself for that battle. And thankfully, that combat system has a really a really good customization system to back it up. So for example, the spell system in the game is pretty free flowing. You can kind of assign any spell to any character. They're based off these orbs that you put on them. But these orbs are not specific spells as much as they are elements. So these elements, when you put them on the character, determine what spells they can use, and they can combine different orbs of different elements to create new spells and things like that. Then there's also opposing elements as well. So if you have opposing elements on a character, actually reduce their ability in other elements based off the weaknesses that they apply to them and stuff like that. So it's like a really interesting system where you can go and kind of customize these orbs or your characters with these orbs and try to figure out what you want to do with the character. And because characters, can stack skills onto each other, you don't necessarily want one character to be the wind magic character. You don't necessarily want one character to be the water magic character. You kind of want to mix and match them a lot of the times. It's maybe a little bit more complicated than it should be, though. There's a shop system that you can use to kind of level up how much MP you have within a certain category spell. You can also level up the effectiveness of certain elements and certain spells of certain levels. But there's a limited number of points you can set, and it also costs money as well. So it's really expensive, and it is often easy for you to kind of over-assign certain points to certain areas, but the game lets you kind of reset it. But it's a pretty limited number of resources, and also the number of orbs you have are fairly limited as well. So you don't always have the full capability to configure your party's magic layout, and the way you want to, without really tearing away at the resources you have, kind of thing. So maybe it's a little too complicated at times, but honestly, it was something that I was able to make work and kind of sit with the same build for most of the second half of the game. Weapons in the game don't really have stats, but they have special effects. So, there is no weapon that's necessarily directly better than another. But there are a key special effect that's locked to that weapon. So that can be things like increased critical hit rate or increased EXP at the end of battle and all that kind of stuff. But there are additional skills that are on that weapon when you first get them, but you have to unlock them from that weapon. So when you level that weapon up, these skills will eventually be removable from that weapon, so you can take a skill from one weapon and move it to another. There's one that's always locked to that weapon, but the other ones are unlockable. And then these skills come off as blocks, and these blocks are different Tetris sizes and things like that. And when you level up a weapon, you open up more spaces to equip on that weapon. So you can basically go ahead and start building out new weapons based off how these pieces fit together. And because they all have set pieces and can't be rotated and things like that, there's a lot of thought put into, making sure you can't overload on certain elements without kind of sabotaging your build a little bit. And how that actually plays out is that when a weapon gets max level, there's a special skill associated with it, which is also locked to the weapon. And that special skill only happens if you fill out the entire set of blocks. So you have to fit everything perfectly in. And if you don't do that, you lose that skill. So it's a lot of time-consuming elements with not only grinding weapons to pull off their skills and things like that, but also in customizing them, trying to get the most out of weapons and things like that. It does mean that you'll spend a lot of time in the game kind of running around with bad weapons to try to get their skills, but it is something that I think is a really satisfying system, and when you take it into boss fights especially, you kind of try to use everything you have to kind of build these best weapon sets that complement your characters and their builds and things like that. So I'd say this combat system is definitely the best thing about this game. Is just, there are some hiccups there with just a lot of time consumption and resource management at times and needing to grind a little bit. but I think it's really satisfying, and it is something that is really not afraid to challenge you in a way that I think many other RPGs are afraid to challenge you. So if you want something that's a difficult JRPG that requires you to really think about its mechanics, this is a great game for that. Where things are a little bit more antsy, but I think still really worth considering the game for, is when it comes to kind of its storytelling and the character interactions that they have. Because there's like some really neat ideas here that, while they sound kind of plain on paper, I think ultimately are implemented in really interesting ways. So like a lot of JRPGs, it is very much a church bad kind of story. Basically, there's two major religions in this world, and there's one religionless city, I think. I think that's how it works out. And they all are kind of at conflict with each other, essentially. And so what the story definitely starts out at is church is bad. Whoops. With the church that we were working with is actually a bad thing. So the game follows, your main party, and you're going through this whole like church bad story. But at some point, and I won't give the details of exactly what happens, but there's a secondary party that shows up. And they are kind of affiliated with the other religion. And they're both of you guys are basically trying to save the world, but often in different and conflicting ways. Again, kind of a normal story point overall, but what I think is really neat about how Rise Fantasia handles this is that they kind of treat the second party as a second party in a video game as well. So you have this other party going around the world, and there's times where you're competing for them or with them for resources. So there's like a dungeon where you have to race them to the finish, and if you do not get there in time, they get the thing from that dungeon and you do not get it anymore, right? And so you kind of have this like conflict with them. Each group has kind of like a core cast, but there's also like this really interesting dynamic where other characters, kind of like the fringes of your party, have their own objectives. And so sometimes they will group up with your side, and sometimes they'll group up with the other team just based off what they need to do. So it's this constant like back and forth as characters kind of like swap between parties and things like that. And both teams are really kind of wrestling with, what it means to save the world. And this is also like a big part of the story as well, since each side is, on a religious journey, and they're, both kind of conflicted with the faults of their religion, but how each side handles that is different, and they come to different conclusions from it. One element that, helps your journey, may be something that is the ending the world on their side, and the same vice versa. So there's like things you're doing to the world that are ultimately hurting the other player's quest a little bit. The execution is a bit rough here. There's a lot of conflict between these two parties, and I would not say they're particularly deep. There's a lot of, I think, questionable dialogue in how that stuff is conveyed. But the template here is very cool, and I think very few characters are treated as objectively good, and I think they do a great job drawing a gray line between everything. Even some of the villains in the game, in some ways, if you look at it at the end, could be kind of viewed as heroes in hindsight, which is kind of interesting. It's a very messy game when it comes to politics, but that's part of the reason why I like it so much. The biggest problem is its localization, and I played it dubbed, which was... It's bad. It's not a good dub. I definitely have a little bit of a soft spot for people who are clearly trying to some extent to do this, but definitely the execution, for whatever reason here, is just not particularly good. The Japanese undub is available, so if you can patch the game, I would probably recommend it for most people. I really can't say how much of the game is hurt by either the writing or the voice acting, so maybe unpatching or undubbing the game will not help that much, but the voice acting for sure is just kind of flat overall. There's some occasional so bad it's good moments, but not enough I'd recommend it for that. You're going to get a few of those, and you'll probably find most of those on YouTube rather than having, playing a whole 70-hour RPG to get into those. But the big thing is it does damage some of the more serious moments in the game, the more tragic moments. There's definitely moments that you're supposed to feel something for a character, but the voice actor they have just cannot convey it right. So if you want to try a different thing than what I did, go ahead and try the Japanese undub. And I think especially for people who only speak English, at the very least, not knowing that language kind of covers up some of the blemishes you would see in a language that you understand, right? So But the small things I can say about the English dub that I do think were a positive is that I do think that the main character is pretty good at capturing the main character's indifference at times. The main character is kind of built in a way where he is, I mean, again, not particularly special in this regard, but he is very much like I don't care about religion, but I'm on this religious path kind of thing, right? And I think he does a good job of conveying that indifference with that. And then he has a companion who's kind of supposed to be this like sheltered, awkward girl with a lot of like really weird turns of phrases. So she'll like pull turns of phrases from people and doesn't know what they mean, but will just use them in random situations. And it's kind of fun. I kind of like it a lot. And it's kind of intended to be awkward and bad at times. And sometimes I think these moments get kind of called bad acting when really the thing is that it's kind of intended to be an awkward moment in a lot of ways. Kind of like the Final Fantasy X laugh, right, with Titus. But, you know, I think saying that some of the voice acting is bad is intentional really can only get you so far because the rest of the game feels the same way, but without the feeling that they are in on it versus those two characters in certain particular moments. So especially if you remove the dub though, I think this is a fantastic game. It definitely is not as grandiose as like Xenoblade Chronicles or The Last Story. But what I think it does is it excels in its own unique ways that just aren't as obvious, with the scenario just being a really distinct kind of scenario that really kind of tries to deliver on a unique setup when it comes to how these characters interact with each other and the fact that they collaborate but then also are against each other at the same time, I think is kind of a fun thing. And the fact that they're treated like an actual RPG party separate of you. And then also just the intensely deep combat system, you know, aside from some of the downtime you got to spend with like, you know, customizing your stuff, which some people I think will be into. And I was definitely into that to some degree and definitely needed to grind at times for me, myself at least. You know, is a little bit slow, but I think that the combat system's depth is just so extensive that it is really, really worth your time. And the game knows that its combat system is good and will use it to the fullest extent, I think. So I think that's really awesome. So, you know, if you are a JRPG fan, and especially if you're like, I want to play every JRPG on the Wii, I really think Rise Fantasia is a must-play JRPG on the Wii.